Well, it's genuinely great to be back in Portland. And Portland is one of my favourite places to visit. I know speakers say that, but as an Australian, I genuinely mean it. And yeah, Bridgetown also has been a place that every time I've visited Portland, I've spoken at. And last time I was here is in 2019. So it's really good to be back and be back in this building. I actually was in this building just before it got renovated. So it's also really cool to come here and just see this place done beautifully, but also to see what is the effects of when there is a spiritual renovation. I think that when I connected with Bridgetown, connected with John Mark, we and some other friends in other churches were really interested in the question of what if we began to look at church very differently in a context like ours. Melbourne's a very progressive city. Portland's a progressive city. Australia's a very secular country. Portland has that secularity thing going for the United States, which is a much more religious country for a Western country, but Portland's a bit of an outlier, but also perhaps a bit of a harbinger of where the spiritual direction of some of the country may indeed be going. But really what connected us was an interest of what if you did church differently? A lot of the received wisdom of the time was that church needed to grow by making things easier. Better car parking, nicer patterns on carpets, more programs, more options, shorter services. So, I don't know, mum and dad can get to kids' hockey practice quickly. And there was a sense that this was running adrift in cities like ours because the consumer Christian thing doesn't work very well if you don't have many cultural Christians in your city. And there's a sense where there's an antipathy towards faith. So going back now, right back to I think my first visits, Bridgetown entered into a process which also we did at Red Church where you begin to look at practices and formation and how do you actually grow people deeper versus just growing bums on seats. How do you actually have internal growth inside of us where we become more like Jesus? And it's really encouraging to come back and see the fruit of that. If you're just trying to grow a church and get bums on seats, there's very easily measurable indicator, which is how many bums are on seats. But actually seeing spiritual growth is harder to initially pick up. It's something that you pick up in how people talk, what they're interested in, the spiritual atmosphere of churches, and it's just been really encouraging. My wife was here a few months ago and came away profoundly blessed. Not just because, wow, amazing worship or what a great sermon, those things are good here, but just in how people spoke, how they spoke of God, prayer patterns. So what I want to say is I think both my church and your church are churches which have benefited from the long-term project of pressing into spiritual formation. But as I have reflected of recent times, I've also begun to ask the question, what do we need to be aware of for churches where, we've bought the program, we're going to do it, we're committed to this. What do we need to be aware of? And I've always got an eye for what God is doing in the culture, and my first visits to Bridgetown were talking about what God is doing in the culture. So what I'd love to do is begin to ask the question, what do we need to be aware of in the culture which can actually undermine our pursuit of spiritual formation, and how can actually the pursuit of spiritual formation almost begin to turn against us? So, to do this, in this first lecture, I actually did say to a friend today, I caught up with a friend for lunch, and he said to me, what are you doing tonight? I said, I'm doing a lecture. And he's like, sorry, I don't know what that is. A lecture? And I just realized, this is a lecture. And then I thought about how Australians say it. We say it nothing like the word, like lecture. Anyway, that's not why I'm here. But I just want to, in this first talk, give a little bit of a history of some of the cultural factors around us which we may not be aware of but can misguide our pursuit of spiritual formation. And to do this, I want to go back to 1973. In 1973, the world faced a crisis. The Western world, my country and yours, had enjoyed a kind of golden period when it came to economics. And from 1946 onwards, my country's economy and your country's economy grew at an incredible rate. The European economies had been bombed, Japan had been bombed, and America was really one of the biggest, fastest growing manufacturing economies in the world, and Australia was the little brother learning from America. And the golden period, as some economists call this, really consisted of two things. The productivity of the society was growing, so the economy was growing, and at the same time, people's wages were growing to meet. So if you look at a chart, it went like that. And when that happens, it's golden times. Because your country is getting better. There's more stuff to spend on infrastructure. You can build that train line. You can build that hospital. The streets get better. But at the same time, your life's getting better. You can afford more. You can buy a better house. Your employer pays you more. There's more jobs. And so your country's living standard is getting better. At the same time, your living standard is getting better. Was this everyone? No. But was this the general economic outlook? Yes. So this is why sometimes when, there's sort of these hazy look-backs at this post-war period from economists as this golden period where things seem to work. 1973, this starts to go adrift. And there's a whole conversation about why this is so. Why does things go adrift in 1973? And I'm not going to answer this, but something comes along called inflation. Heard of it? And another thing comes along called stagnation. So what happens is inflation rises, means that prices go up, your wages don't necessarily go up, so it eats away at your standard of living. But at the same time, as the economies began to stagnate, it's bad to have stagnation, it's bad to have inflation, but when those two things combine, you have stagflation. This is not cool. Also, there is an oil crisis, OPEC, the oil cartel, in reaction to what is happening in Palestine, then creates an oil embargo and basically stops cutting off oil sales or changes the price of oils to punish countries for supporting Israel to Palestine. Inflation, Palestine, none of this is relevant to our moment. This is very similar to our situation. And what happens is you begin to see American cities change. A place like New York, which is growing in the 1950s, by the 1970s, they're making movies like Warriors, and then you have movies like Escape from New York. And all of a sudden, you start to see this change because infrastructure starts to degrade. People's wages aren't going up. And so this creates a giant crisis around productivity in the culture. But then in the 1980s, there's this new era which comes in. And this is ushered by leaders such as Margaret Thatcher, in the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan here, where there's a new way that they're going to get productivity from the economy. It's a big story. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but I do want to focus in on one particular thing that happened in the workforce where people began to see that what they need to focus on was not the workers or the workforce, but the individual productivity of the worker. See, one thing that happened in the 1970s is power had gone to workers and workers were striking. But then in the 1980s, power goes back to the employers, and all of a sudden, a new way of working began to enter into the workplace, based around efficiency and productivity. And certain metrics could be put in place so that the individual worker could work to a much higher level of efficiency. And this is how we're going to get rid of stagnation and grow productivity. We were going to squeeze more lemon juice out of the lemon, which is to get more efficiency and productivity out of the worker. By the way, welcome to economics and life in the American workforce. This is not the lecture you thought you came for, necessarily. We'll get there, don't worry. Now, all of a sudden, things which were unheard of before, all of a sudden, companies had mission statements. And individual workers had to point towards the mission statement, and then individual workers used to have key performance indicators. Key performance indicators, you need to hit these targets and you need to have these values because we want to get more productivity out of you as the individual worker. Now, this changed the workforce. And as you'll learn, it eventually changed the whole of the culture. The focus shift from the collective to the individual. My grandfather was a trade unionist in Melbourne, worked on the tramways, and he had a very, this is us against the bosses mentality. He had a sense of this is our neighborhood against the people in the richer part of town. But that disappeared, and very much it became the individual worker. Is the individual worker hitting the key performance indicators or not? So it created atomization. Every worker was this individual, but also created this environment of constant evaluation. There was performance reviews. This was a new thing. And all of a sudden you would sit down with your boss and there would be a performance review. How are you hitting the KPIs? And then at times there was restructuring where if you didn't hit the KPIs, you might lose your job. If your factory didn't hit the KPIs, the factory might get shut down. And then in the 1980s, it was started in the 1970s, but 1980s, all of a sudden people found that there were other parts in the world where factories could be moved to, and you weren't just competing against, other workers at your factory, you're competing against people in Malaysia or China or Mexico where the factory could move to. So it creates this constant anxiety, and it creates this competitive environment. So atomization, constant evaluation, and a competitive environment. Now, in the 1980s, a new thing also emerges. And you hear stories of it in lifestyle magazines, and it has strange stories of a new illness that had entered the world, entered America. It was a sort of mini pandemic, but it was called the yuppie flu. The yuppies were the young, upwardly mobile professionals. And the yuppie flu was actually this sickness that high-powered executives who are now working in this very competitive environment were experiencing, where they began to get sick and their adrenal system would burn out. There was increasing stories of executives who were trying to stay fit, having heart attacks when jogging or playing racquetball. In Japan, increasing stories about salarymen, as they're called in Japan, these people who work for these large Japanese conglomerates, we're increasingly experiencing this burnout where they'd lose it. And some Japanese companies actually put in their basements rooms with sort of blow-up dolls of the bosses where you could bash up and beat up the boss just to try and deal with this burnout stress culture. Stress became something that became normative in the workplace in these environments. Now, at the core of this, we have to remember, is a kind of idea that high productivity comes from high performance. I'm going to say that again. A new workplace where high productivity comes from high performance. Now, the word performance is really interesting because the word performance refers to a couple of things. First of all, you can talk about performance in the terms of an actor, yet displaying actions to others, standards of success, where we're constantly evaluated by how we're performing to others because we're almost acting out a role. And in cultures of high performance, there can be this blurring between authenticity and acting. Does that person really love their job, or are they just acting in that particular way? Also, there's this other sense to it where you're constantly, as we said, being evaluated. So what this did was, eventually, and I'm fast forwarding now, is you began to see that this productivity culture began to hit a kind of in the workplace ceiling, which it couldn't get past. And then you begin to see in the 2000s slowly, begins a bit with Gen X, slacker movement, in the Pacific Northwest is one of the homes of this movement where it emerges, is there begins to be this rejection. You have places like Seattle where you've got Microsoft and Boeing and these big companies which are hitting all these high-performance things, but at the same time you've got grunge and people just wearing flannels and not caring anymore. So you've got this counterpoint going on in the culture. See, this is bringing it relevant now. And you have this almost response to it. And this has only gotten stronger in our age. This has just grown and grown and grown as burnout has gotten further and more widespread. Now, interestingly, people are prepared. In the 80s, the sense was to do this high productivity because there was high reward. You get to be the guy who's got a Porsche. You get to be the person who gets to go on the vacation she wants to go on.
So there was a sense that we'll do this high productivity because there's high reward. If you work really, oh no, I won't make a joke. I was going to make a political joke, but I'm in America. I probably could have made it. It's Poland. But anyway, I'm just going to move on. It was about working hard and being a building entrepreneur. But anyway, whatever. That you could get to this point and be a reward. But what begins to happen is people start to ask the question, is the high productivity giving me the reward? So basic political theory is social contract. People will give away freedom to a government or someone above them if they then provide a level of reward for that. So the social contract begins to break down when you don't get the Porsche, you don't get the better life. You're just working really hard and you begin to go, why on earth am I doing this? Now, a few other interesting things happens. Now, number one, productivity doesn't answer really the crisis in our economies. Productivity and this high performance culture doesn't solve our problem of productivity, and the West still begins to struggle with productivity. And part of the reason is what they discover is, yes, you can improve a human by giving them some KPIs and mission statement. Not all of this is bad, hear me. If you're sitting here and you've got a company like, I do all that stuff, I'm not saying this is bad. But we hit this ceiling when these KPIs of a human, and just say we got a person here, right, and we got all the best life coaches and everything, and we got around them and we improved their performance, there's still a certain ceiling that a human hits because they've got to sleep, they've got to have a social life, they've got to breathe, they've got to go to the bathroom, they've got to do actually really human things because humans are finite creatures, we're mortal, we get sick, stuff happens, we're social creatures, we have to have a life. So what happens is the lemon runs out of juice. We can't squeeze it anymore, and we hit a ceiling of productivity. Second, burnout culture becomes widespread. It's no longer just yuppies and Japanese salarymen who are experiencing it. All of a sudden, you begin to see, and this is really in the last 15 to 20 years, where people all throughout the culture are experiencing what high-powered executives experienced in the 1980s, or people working for large Japanese corporations. See, the KPIs, the key performance indicators, broke out, and the performance ethic broke out of its containment in the workplace and then moved into everyday life and our personal lives. Now, partially this was because one of the answers, as efficiency didn't work with humans as much, there was another answer they had, and it again emerged from this part of the world, down south further, on this coast, is that the internet would be the magical bullet which would improve American productivity. It hasn't really, but what it did do is bring an algorithmic measuring, evaluation, and comparison out of the boardroom and the shared office into the pocket of everyone, from 80-year-olds comparing stuff, boomer memes on Facebook, all the way down to 6-year-olds trying to get on social media. So this actually then just spread burnout culture everywhere, and the yuppie flu became an everyone flu as we almost became filled with anxiety and adrenal burnout as we're constantly in this world of measuring everything. This just increases. COVID happens, and all of a sudden, our social interactions are even less with other people, and our online interactions goes, but things are scrambled. All of a sudden, there's work from home, offices shut down in the cities, and there's this really strong reaction against this. In China, Jack Ma talks about this kind of life where, as a Chinese worker, you need to work these tremendous hours in a particular workplace, but then there has this reaction called the lie flat movement, where people are like, we're just not going to do this anymore. In the, you see things on like the work your wage movement. If they're just going to pay you a little bit, that's all you should try. People start complaining about things like this emotional labor, that if you're a greeter at a store, it's not worth expending your emotional energy at other people. There was the goblin mode trend. Have you heard of this? Where you just give up trying and just basically end up looking like a goblin because you've just completely given up. But at the same time, there's also this other reaction. And particularly as the world becomes more chaotic, and the great sort of programs of trying to change the world seem to struggle in the face of an increasingly chaotic and sometimes dystopic world, is that there comes this chance to, well, I can't control the outside world, so I'm going to control my world. And so you see the lie down movement, the goblin thing, like just give up, I'm just going to play computer games and not leave my house, and I haven't changed my track pants in a week, that sort of giving up. To then you also see this, hang on, I'm going to almost take the bull by the horns, and I'm going to master the tools of titans. I'm going to have mastery over myself. I'm going to develop the most amazing morning routine. I'm going to, work out to this level. Like, have you seen how many, miles I've run today? And we have all these measurement tools around us. And it's this, in a sense, this ethic of trying to get a sense of peace and control through us taking controls of the means of practices, where it's life hacks, habits, and practices, and we're going to take it back. And by doing this, I will deliver a fantastic, wonderful life. Two extremes. Giving up, running yourself silly, trying to take control by using these methods of performance. But what happens is, this creates a new shame dynamic. Shame seemingly had disappeared in the West, and often people would contrast the West with its permissiveness and its hedonism with cultures which had an honor-shame culture. But we get a new kind of shame culture where you do not feel that you are living up to the high performance standards. And they're no longer just the ones in the corporate workplace. They're like, I'm looking at Instagram and she's a mum and she looks great and she's had 3 kids and look what she's doing today and her kitchen's so neat. And I feel rubbish looking at that on there because she's hitting some unspoken KPIs and I fall short of them. Or I'm putting out to the world, here's all the KPIs I'm hitting, I'm bubbly and I'm wonderful and it's fun and I come to church and I'm saying hi to everyone, but actually at home, I'm struggling with all this stuff going on inside. So weirdly, the KPI culture, which has a place, has now taken over the world, and we live under the reign of a high-performance culture which is not producing anything. And I'll end this. The problem is, I know this is 25 minutes, but this is my reading glasses, and it's just a blur as to what the number is up there. This is my last point. The danger, then, for churches like mine or yours, with spiritual formation, which is so healthy, is that these underlying cultural trends, often undiagnosed, can warp our pursuit of ancient practices, where the practices become a kind of performance culture with a Christian veneer that instead of freeing us, oppress us.